Bit of a shock to see this morning that the stewards have ruled against Max Verstappen and given him a penalty going into the Qatar Grand Prix. You'll recall he was on the pole, as we mentioned yesterday in our video. He's now been given a one-place grid penalty, which means, of course, he'll be starting on the inside, on the dirtier side of the track, but he will have the inside run down to the first corner. So stand back, Max versus George all of a sudden. But I have to say, I am confused by the stewards' decision, starting with what they call the fact, which is their heading, basically, of the decision they've taken to give Max that penalty. The fact, they say, is car one, Max Verstappen, drove unnecessarily slowly on a cool-down lap. I don't get that, because it wasn't a cool-down lap. It was a warm-up lap. It was the lap before he did his pole lap. And he was only on one set of tyres, remember. He wasn't thinking of cooling the tyres. He was thinking of distances and gaps. That's what he was trying to do. That's why he let Fernando Alonso past earlier that lap, just to get a bit of cushion and space. That's what it was all about. It wasn't about a cool down. It wasn't a cool down lap anyway. Cool down lap is after you've done your quickest lap, and then you're coming into the pits, and you can maybe go offline, maybe you can put some crud on the tyres in case you go to the weigh check, things. That is a cool down lap. This wasn't a cool down lap. This was a warm-up lap, and the difference is that on a warm-up lap, no driver wants to be off the racing line. Everybody wants to keep their tyres as clean as possible, and above all, you want to make sure you've got enough space in front of you to be able to do the lap you want to do when you cross the start-finish line. That's what that preparatory warm-up lap is all about. Okay, so that's the first mistake, in my view, that the stewards have made. It could be that in their vernacular of rule-making, they only have two words, push lap and cool down lap. They don't distinguish between cool down laps and warm-up laps. Well, if that's the case, then they need to, because a cool down lap is not a warm-up lap. Very, very different things. That's the first point. And then the first two paragraphs of the ruling talk about Max having been outside the delta. This is the delta that they talk about, the minimum speed below which you're not allowed to drop, in order to try to keep the cars moving at a reasonable pace around the lap to stop bunching. But rules like that do have the grey area, as we saw yesterday, when something like, 15, 20 drivers were all outside the delta, and there was no penalty given, no further action taken. So this delta thing, yeah, it's there to try to get the drivers not to bunch, but at the same time, it's a very, very difficult thing to adjudicate. And that's because, as Max did in this hearing with George Russell, he pointed out that at one stage of that lap, the specific lap when the incident occurred, prior to turn 12, he slowed to let Fernando Alonso pass. And that's fair enough. You're allowed to do that. And then you have to make up your time a little bit and do that. But the stewards make the point that Max was well outside his delta for that lap. And that complicated things. Well, be that as it may, I think we should take some corners on their own merit. Eau Rouge might be one. Going into the swimming pool at Monaco might be another. And this is a third. Turn 12 is an unbelievably quick corner. Fernando Alonso, hats off to Fernando, got to say, in that Aston Martin, 8th gear entry, 291 kilometers an hour entry speed. No other driver was using 8th in qualifying, and no other driver I saw was over 290 kilometers an hour going into that. Really, really impressive. But not impressive on this lap where the incident occurred. Fernando was also on a warm-up lap. He was about to do that 291 entry. And maybe he was trying to keep the tyres cool. I don't know what he was doing. But anyway, let's look at the numbers of what Fernando was actually doing on the approach to turn 12, which is an uphill straight. He was doing 265 in 7th gear on the approach to turn 12. And then suddenly, while still traveling in a straight line, he braked very hard down to 129 in 3rd gear. Now he's got Max Verstappen behind him, who's doing 257 in 7th as well, approximately the same speed. And Max behind Fernando, and he's on a warm-up lap, remember, so he's not about to start going offline to avoid anything, brakes down hard to 163 kilometers an hour in 4th gear. And so they go into that, and that's just going into turn 12. George Russell, presumably can see all this happening, is doing 271 in 7th as he approaches them. But instead of braking hard in concert with Max and Fernando, he swerves to the left, to the outside, keeps it in 5th gear, and presumably damages the floor. Now immediately afterwards, George Russell said, and then he repeated this obviously to the stewards, that on a fast corner like that, it's totally unacceptable for Max Verstappen to be travelling that slowly on the racing line. Well, my response to that is, he was on the racing line, partly because it was a warm-up lap, and the last thing he was going to do is go onto the gravel. That is why he braked that hard, not to run into the back of Fernando. And the surprise for me is that George didn't do the same thing. Why didn't George just brake behind Max, and then they all would have continued and found their gaps again. And so for me, there are two major problems with this ruling. One, it wasn't a cool-down lap, it was a warm-up lap. And two, to say that Max was travelling unduly slowly on the racing line on a fast corner is to gloss over the reality of what happened. And there's no mention in the steward's decision of any discussions with Fernando Alonso as to why he did brake so hard and cause that concertina effect. But it is interesting, is it not, that at the end of this ruling, which I think is spurious, that they say that it was obvious in reality that the driver of car 63, George Russell, did have clear visibility of car 1 and that neither car was on a push lap. Well, we know they went on a push lap. That was obvious. But they are making the point that George could see what was going on in front of him, I guess. Whether he could see Fernando, I don't know. I mean, the one thing I've got to say in mitigating circumstances here is that I don't have access to GPS. But it's pretty clear that Max stayed on the racing line because he was on his warm-up lap, and Fernando also stayed on the racing line, and to avoid him, he had to brake hard. And just to repeat what happened, Fernando was doing 265 in 7th on the approach there, and then slammed on the brakes down to third gear, 130 kilometers an hour. You know, what's Max going to do behind him if that happens? He's not going to go offline to dirty the tyres on his preparatory warm-up lap. It's not a cool-down lap. So that's my take on that. I guess the best thing about this is that it's only a one-place grid penalty. If it was a three-place grid penalty, you could get very annoyed about it because that would let the McLarens in front of Max. But as I say, stand back for that first corner. No love lost now, I would guess, between Max and George. I'm not sure there ever was anyway, but none now. That is for sure. So let's see what happens.